So thank you for joining us today and for that great talk. There's so much going on. But what do you think about NAFTA and how much we need to be concerned about what's going on with that, especially here in Minnesota?
Well, NAFTA is, as I alluded to earlier, NAFTA is going to be the sort of real first big test case of what kind of a Mr. Trump do we see. And he obviously campaigned on NAFTA was a disaster, and he's going to build a wall, and Mexico's going to pay for it, and all of that stuff. And since the inauguration, my sense very strongly, both from Mexico and from the Canadians, has been that actually there's been some sort of dialing back of that, and that there will be a renegotiation of NAFTA, or there will be changes to NAFTA. But frankly, that's okay, because NAFTA was signed, in 1993? There are whole sectors of the economy, the whole digital economy that is now so important, didn't really exist then. And so there's nothing in NAFTA on the digital economy. So it makes enormous sense to have some renegotiation of NAFTA. The question is, how big will it be, and will it be sensible? And what the more optimistic people hope is that many of the things that were already agreed to in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP deal, which President Trump pulled out of on his first day in office, they were really already agreed between the Canadians, the Mexicans, and the Americans in that context. And so those, literally, the language may just get lifted and put into the renegotiated NAFTA. So against that background, which is a sort of relatively benign background, how do we make sense of today's action? And I'm reasonably sanguine about it. I mean, softwood lumber, which the details of which you will know more about than me, but it has been a source of bilateral trade for decades. And there was a special agreement that lasted until 2015, but there's do the Canadians artificially subsidize or not? They would say not. So but it's not as though it's a completely new area that President Trump has found. This is a long-standing area of disagreement. So is dairy, which is another one. So if the protectionism is limited to isolated tariffs of that sort, we've been there before. President Obama put on tariffs, President George W. Bush put on tariffs, President Reagan put on tariffs. This is not, I don't welcome it as a good free trader, but it's not out of the ordinary.
Probably comes back to the two different President Trumps that we're looking at too. And with that, when you think about what you talked about with China earlier, we've seen China invest in other countries over the last few decades in terms of debt, in terms of infrastructure programs, and in terms of just political strength. Do you think we need to be concerned in the United States about China kind of getting ahead of us if we don't keep growing faster than our GDP grew last year?
Well, you've put a lot of important things into that question. One is China going to grow faster than the US? Of course China's going to grow faster than the US. It's got more people. It's a poorer country. It's catching up, if you will. China's growth rate this year will be somewhere between 6% and 7%. The US growth rate, if the US is lucky, it'll hit 3%. I'd be surprised if it does that. It's not going to go anywhere near to these numbers that are being bandied around in Washington right now. So, but that's a function of differential, levels of income. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. Nor, and it's worth saying, and I'm sure there's nobody in this audience who believes that, but the trade deficit between the US and China is not by itself a bad thing. This is becoming the new mantra in Washington, that if you have a trade deficit, you've struck a bad deal or something's wrong. It's really not the case. You can have free trade. Doesn't necessarily mean whether your country has a deficit or a surplus depends on how much it saves relative to others and how much it invests relative to others. So if the US is a brilliantly fast-growing place and lots of people want to invest here and the US wants to invest a lot, then it'll have a current account deficit, as the economists say. So I wouldn't worry about that. What does matter is, which is more innovative, which is more productive, where are the new ideas, where is all of this new technological revolution happening, where are the brightest ideas going, the best ones, and that's where I think the US still has a fundamental advantage over pretty much everyone else, because the combination, if the US stays open, of extraordinary higher education, a financial system that funds through its venture capital and so forth, funds new ideas, still, despite the slowing, a remarkably flexible economy. That's a hard to beat set of ingredients. I mean, the US really has to mess up to let all of that go to waste.
What do you see happening elsewhere in the world relative to the United States when it comes to immigration policies? Because sometimes we look at it from the US perspective like, oh boy, things are changing, but it's changed so much elsewhere too.
Well, we're pretty close to you about making it hard for other people with our Brexit. But I think you have to separate two things. One is the free movement of skilled, educated, sort of high-skilled immigration, which is really key to having those kind of sort of successful movement of ideas and successful modern economies. The second is the much more difficult problem of low-skilled immigration, whether it's migration from North Africa to Europe, whether it's migration from Central America to the US. Now, I happen to believe that the gains to an economy from low-skilled migration are also very palpable and very obvious, and that actually the US economy would be in much worse shape if it didn't have that, just as the British economy would be in much worse shape if we didn't have East Europeans coming to work in our Starbucks and work on our agricultural fields. But there is no doubt a political challenge of the pace of that kind of immigration. And certainly what we've seen in Britain is that people find high levels of that kind of immigration, coupled at a time of austerity when public services are being squeezed, they find that politically very difficult. And so I think that will continue to be, around the world, a very tough balancing act, because to be sort of really crude and oversimplistic, the advanced economies are aging. They're going to need more people. Those people are going to be largely in Africa or in South Asia, because that's where the demographic shifts are. Now, how rapidly can our societies adjust to integrating people? And it's clearly not, we don't have infinite capacity. We've learned that in the last 2 years. But my own view is that the more open, the better. But I recognize that that is going to be a very important area of political debate.
From that, let's also talk education, because you're talking about how important that is, and to possibly rethink education. I think the last time the United States actually thought of how we do our secondary school was in the early 1900s in terms of how we set it up. But what do you see working elsewhere in the world when it comes to educational changes to really make sure that employers and societies are keeping up with the technological changes as fast as they need to also then attract or grow that talent?
Well, it's a really good question, and I think the answer, the sort of simple answer, is that no one has really cracked this. That the idea of lifetime learning, which I'm obviously not the only person advocating this, but that's become a bit of a slogan now. More and more people are recognizing that we need to think in that way. No country has sort of, you can't say, look, go and copy X, they've done it brilliantly. That said, some are further ahead than others. Singapore has a lifetime learning credit where every Singaporean gets a credit. I think it's for $900 a year, but for some amount, not enormous, but not nothing, to put towards training, and they can save them up from year to year. And so the Singaporeans, and Singapore is often a place that's, it's relatively small, but it's quite an interesting sort of laboratory for public policy ideas. And Singapore has gone there. I'd also perhaps point to the Scandinavians. One always points to Scandinavians when you think about interesting policy innovations, but the Swedes and the Danes have certainly thought much harder about retraining and successfully retraining people. People often talk about the brilliance of the German apprenticeship program. The problem with the German apprenticeship program is it's tied very closely to individual professions, and it's sort of tied to the guild system, which means that it's actually not that great for a 21st century economy where you're probably going to be changing jobs. But certainly a focus on vocational training. We have this sort of college or bust system right now, and something that is in between, and thinking about things more across people's lifetimes. And that's actually where, and there's a lot of you I know who are business leaders here, it's surely somewhere where businesses need to work with academic institutions and the state. So I'm not calling for a kind of massive new government program. I'm not calling for, universities to shut up shop. No, absolutely not. I just think that these three sets of actors need to work together to think about how do we ensure that people have the skills for very different kinds of jobs throughout their life.
Great, thank you. We also have some questions that came in about Africa and South America. And what do you think about those two continents and what's going on in terms of opportunities, economies, and where business leaders here perhaps should be thinking about what they do next?
Well, it's increasingly difficult to generalize about regions, but I'm going to do it. But so South America, and I say this acknowledging that it's massively simplistic, but with some exceptions, Latin America, basically the big economies, Brazil has had a very, very tough 2 years. It's been in a really deep recession. It's obviously had a huge number of political scandals. I think it's coming out of that, and I think that the corruption cleanup has actually been incredibly cathartic there. I think the underlying economic strengths of Brazil are very real. It's a huge economy. It's a continental-sized economy that has a lot of potential. Argentina had, years of being mismanaged under the Kirchner regime. Now again has the potential and is turning back towards freer markets. The Andean countries, Colombia, Ecuador, have been doing remarkably well. Chile's done very well for a long time. The big tragedy now in that part of the world is Venezuela, which is, in a slow motion collapse. And at some point, the economy will collapse. And at some point, completely. I mean, it's already, by our standards, it's already collapsed. But it will utterly collapse in a way that presumably will force the change of government and hopefully some economic reforms. But broadly, I think it's a part of the world that has a huge amount of potential. Africa also, is the youngest part of the world. It's in 20 years, it's going to be where all the dynamism and growth is, potentially because that's where the young, fast-growing labor force is going to be. They haven't yet got to the peak of what people call the demographic dividend. When your birth rate comes down, but your share of workers in the economy is going up. A lot of African countries did incredibly well when commodity prices were soaring because China's economy was booming. And that kind of growth on the back of high commodity prices often tends to be wasted. You get a lot of money that comes in because your oil or your iron ore is expensive, and then you fritter it away. And that's happened in quite a lot of African countries. On the other hand, there are others which have really turned the corner on reform. I think in the medium term, Africa has, as it's always had, huge, huge potential. And some of the underlying problems, healthcare, all of those things all are looking much, much better than they were. So basically, a lot of potential, but it's still tiny in terms of its overall share of the global economy.
A couple of questions came in about how can we improve economically but also establish ethical leadership? So when you look at balancing the economic challenges and some of the areas that people want to go into, but then also some of the industries such as energy. How do we look at growing economically, but then also look at the environment?
Well, there's two interesting responses in a particular area of energy, where the shale gas revolution is a remarkable testament to the strengths of American capitalism, where something that would never have happened in any other part of the world, because it was a combination not just of the sort of natural geology, but the ability to get the financing to push for the shale gas companies to push, the debt financing that enabled them to do it, frankly, the legal framework that enabled them to do it. And so to me, that's kind of, sort of shows the strengths of the American system. And shale gas broadly, I think, is a far cleaner form of energy certainly than coal. And so it's broadly a shift in the right direction. On the other side of the ledger, I do think the current noises and actions indeed out of Washington on climate change are extraordinarily short-sighted and unhelpful. I don't think I can put it in any other way. I mean, I don't think, this whole debate about are you a climate change denier or not, I mean, the science is absolutely overwhelming, I think. And I don't, if you put the evidence in front of someone who's been Rip Van Winkle, who's been asleep for the last 30 years and say, what is the planet warming or not? It seems pretty overwhelmingly clear that it is, and we should be doing something. And the world is doing something with the, global climate change talks in Paris and so forth. And so the various regulations that have been signed, rolling back all of that in the US, I think are unfortunate. I suspect they will have less impact on global efforts to counter climate change than you might think, because I think the rest of the world, and particularly China, has realized that it's in their own interests to carry on. And even if the US wants to take a holiday for a few years, the rest of the world isn't going to stop this. And so, and elements within the US will continue. California and the northwestern states, they will all continue what they're doing. And I suspect, it would be interesting to hear from you, but I suspect most businesses are not saying, oh, well, right, that's the end of climate change. I'm now going to go and, assume we have a world where we don't carry on like that. People are going to just plan for the world after this current view in Washington.
Thanks, Zanny.
What's Next? Making Sense of a Global Economy and Hendrickson Forum 2017 is a TPT Partnerships co-production of the Hendrickson Institute for Ethical Leadership of St. Mary's University of Minnesota and Twin Cities PBS.